Good evening, good evening, good evening, and welcome to Milwaukee, You Deserve Better. I'm your host, David D. King, and thank you for tuning in tonight. Thank you for tuning in. I am just good evening, and welcome to Milwaukee. Setting it up where I can send it over into Facebook. And if you would like to make comments, we want you to be able to make comments. You can go to YouTube and you can go to you can also go over to Periscope. We just sent it over to YouTube. And we're going to have a real conversation today. What's going on with everything. And so I'm excited. So I hope you guys would join in with me with everything that's going on. So I'm excited to be with you guys tonight. So we're going to get started in 1 second. Give me just 1 second. So you guys can chat with me. So I want to just say welcome to each and every one of you for coming in. So again, I am your host tonight, David D. King. So I welcome each and every one of you here with me tonight. We're going to have what I call a real conversation because so many people didn't like the last episode that we had. And when I had Pastor Fuller on the show, and they said that we ambushed him and said that we was not supposed to, as a man of God, to be dealing with politics. But I want you guys to understand some things, that we're supposed to be in politics. We're supposed to have our hand in everything that's going on in the world because God told us to occupy. God told us to have dominion over the earth. God told us to subdue, which means control. And when the church does not do anything like we're supposed to do, then what end up happening is what we have today. So we have what's called today where we as born again believers is not supposed to. Hey Sam, thank you so much. I'm glad you're on with me. We're supposed to not do things or say anything about what's going on. But if those of us that are true believers, those of us that say that we really love God, we have a duty not only to God, but to our community to not only do what we're supposed to do, but also to educate people on everything that is going on, So my job as a man of God, supposed to tell the truth on everything that's going on. And I put a post up on yesterday called Deceive Sunday. And don't run to the polls in your emotions, but do your homework and know the facts. And what do I mean by that when I say those kind of things? Do your homework. Don't go in your emotions. Well, right now, if you understand anything about the kingdom of God, we have a mandate by God to dominate the earth, to have dominion over the earth. And in order to do that, we have to understand everything that's going on. So that is why, that is why I do what I do. And I talk about so much everything. Last week, we talked about the indoctrination of our children. We talked about the Equality Act. We talked about how emotionally they're trying to push us to the pole. But if we ever do facts, if we ever look up facts, if we ever just take time out to ask why do you want me to vote for a certain person? We never ask the question why, simply because of the fact that we always done it this way. And because we always done it this way, we never get anything totally done. So we lose out on things. Let's take Milwaukee for an example. And I want you guys to understand, I'm not pushing any candidate. I'm telling you to do your homework. And if you do your homework, I already know which candidate you're going to pick if you do your homework. But when you, as a pastor, we cannot sell the trust of our people. Let me say that again. As a pastor, we cannot sell the trust of our people. We cannot sell the trust of people. People trust us. And because they trust us, the other people in politics or whatever, they understand that we have influence over the people that follow us. So a lot of times what we end up doing is we're getting paid, or we're selling the trust of the people, and we get people to vote. So I want to go back and I want to talk about some of the things that a lot of people says that I bamboozled my guests. And I didn't bamboozle my guests because my guests knew exactly what we was going to talk about. And so I'm a person that says, show me facts. And if you can't show me the facts, then you don't have an argument. So I said to my guests, as a pastor in the city of Milwaukee, how can you support a candidate that's dealing with and approving of and is going to make law for same-sex transgender? And the response was, because he's just a politician. I don't care if they're politicians or not. As men of God, we have a law by God. We have a constitution in the word of God. And as a kingdom citizens, I have to abide by those constitutions. Now, I'm not attacking homosexuals. I'm not downplaying or attacking their lifestyle. I'm standing on the word of God. The word of God told me to love the person, hate the sin, just like God loves me, but hate my sin. So I am not okay with anybody making laws against the law of God. And when you got pastors that are selling out their people to push something that's going to be detrimental if a person get in office. So they said that I was taking the word of God and that I was using the Bible wrong. So let's take a look at this, for example. In the book of Genesis, God gave Adam a specific instruction of which tree not to eat from. He said you can eat from any tree in the garden except for two that's in the midst of the garden, the tree of good and evil and the tree of life. Those two you was not supposed to touch. So what the devil done, he went to Eve and said, did God say? Because the enemy wanted to see if Eve understood what God said. And when Eve started mentioning it, the devil said to you, you will not die. You will be just like God. So what people are doing now is taking what God says and asking questions to leadership to say, well, did God really say that? Or you can have a pass because you're not doing it, but you're supporting a candidate that's doing it. So what they're trying to tell us is God saying, well, you're not doing it, so you can support a candidate that support that, but you don't support it because you preach it in your pulpit. But if I preach it in my pulpit, but I don't live it on the outside of the pulpit, I'm just as bad as the one that's going to make the law against the will of God. And the way they doing law now is they're making everything, whatever's good in the eyes of God, they're making and whatever's good in the eyes of God is now going to be evil. And whatever's evil in the eyes of God, now they're making laws to make it good. And we're not paying that no attention. So you got leadership that's doing souls to the polls. I always get in trouble. I don't mind getting in trouble. But they're not putting all the facts on the table. The Bible also says you will know them by the fruit they bear. So you will know if it's an apple tree, you will know because there's an apple tree. If it's an orange tree, you will know because there's an orange on that tree. So you will know them by the fruit they bear. And what I said was, let's look at both fruit, and both fruits is their policies. And if you look at the policies of both candidates, you will see the policies, which policy is for you and which policy is against you. You know, and when you stand around and we're pushing people to the polls, but we're not breaking down everything to them. We're not breaking down what both candidates really stand for, and we're not breaking down what it means as an individual. What do it mean as an individual? I mean, you look at Milwaukee, our murder rate jumped broke record from, I believe it was 1990. Sam, if you still watching, give me the year that we broke that record, because I don't have that with me right now. But we just broke a record of the most homicides in our city, and the year is not even up yet. And so but we was told to vote in all of these people that's in office now, all these Democrats. They're supposed to be there for the black families. They're supposed to be there for black people, and they was going to take care of you. So my question is, are they really taking care of you right now? You know, and all we got to do is begin to look at the truth. All we got to do is begin to look at what's really, really going on. All we got to do, we got to just put it out on the table. And when you put it out on the table, the reality is that it is what it is, no matter how we look at it, no matter how we sums it up. It is what it is. And a lot of times we don't want to talk about that. I was told by one gentleman that when I asked him, he told me, you know, that he was supporting Biden. This pastor told me that he was supporting Biden. And I said, okay, Biden been in office 47 years. Give me something. 1993. Thank you, Sam. He says, I told him, I said, give me something in 47 years that Biden done that benefit black community. Well, that's not a fair question. I said, what do you mean it's not a fair question? That's not a fair question. I'm like, why not? Why is not a fair question? And he said, it's not a fair question because he was only a senator. And I said, well, give me 3 bills that he had passed based off of what he, you know, that would benefit black community. And he said it again. That's not fair. I said, well, he got passed with Bernie Sanders and Bill Clinton, the 3 strikes you out law that sent a lot of blacks to prison for selling weed and gave them a life sentence. He got that passed. So if he got that passed, then why is it not fair for me to ask you a question on what he's done? You know, so when we really look at everything and what it really stands for, you know, and what's really going on, I'm sorry, I was just doing something to make sure that it got on all the pages. So when you look at any candidate, even our local candidates, what have our local candidates done for you? Those that is asking you to reelect them. See, we're not asking these questions. See, we have right now, we have a mayor, and the crime rate, the murder rate is up the highest since 1993, the highest. And our mayor is already checked out. They have already checked out. He's nowhere to be found unless it's talking about this election or COVID-19. And the reason he checked out, because he thought, this is what he thought. He didn't think the corona was going to be that big, that he thought he was going to have this big, beautiful the Democrat convention here, which it didn't happen. The comptroller lost $249 million. They checked out on us. They don't care about us. Okay. So when you start talking like this, then people get offended because of the fact that we're telling the truth. And when we're telling people the truth, people don't like it and they say it's not fair. It's fair because of the simple fact that if we're going to ever change our city, our state, or even our nation, we have to do our homework. We have to be able to understand what is really going on. We have to be understand what's really going on. I heard a pastor on Sunday. He preached about socialism and communism. And he says socialism and communism was getting ready to come through. It's getting ready to come through Donald Trump. And I started laughing and I put on there, that's not true. Because the liberals, Joe Biden, is pushing socialism and communism. But if people don't do their homework, they will never know. They will never, ever know the truth. And we have to begin to do homework so we'll know the truth, so we can speak on the truth, so we can help our generation that don't know where we really come from. We got a generation that don't know where we come from. Only thing they knew is that we were slaves. That's all they know. They don't know who Henry Highland Garnett is. They don't know who Robert Brown Elliott is. They barely know who Frederick Douglass is. Because why? Nobody is sitting around telling the truth. Nobody. They know who KKK is, but they don't even know where KKK started from. They don't realize that the KKK started from the Democrat Party in the 1800s to shut the mouths of black voters, to shut the mouth of the 7 blacks that was elected into the U.S. Congress and U.S. Senate in the 1800s. Some of them was former slaves. Some of them were self-educated. So they don't even know these kind of stuff. They didn't know that there was a black platoon during the Revolution War. They didn't even know there was a black man on the boat with George Washington when he crossed the Delaware, and he wasn't a slave. So we all wasn't slaves, and we got to get that through our head. Don't let them give you a slave mentality. Don't let them even give you a victim mentality. You're victorious. Look how far we came. Look at all the stuff we endured. Look at everything that we have fought for. Look at everything that went on. See, they don't even know who put the poll tax, the literary tax, so that blacks couldn't vote. It wasn't the Republicans. They didn't try to oppress our votes. They was fighting so you could have the right to vote. And I know Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Bill. I know he signed that. But do you know what else Lyndon Johnson done? He signed that because he had no choice. He was forced to sign that bill. This is why he called himself doing what's called war on poverty. And when he did war on poverty, he came with the welfare system that took the black man out of his house. And most of y'all that's my age understand and know this, because we, as a black person or white person that was poor, that was getting welfare, because the attack was on poor whites and blacks. So you was not even allowed to have a toaster. You wasn't allowed to have a colored TV. You was not allowed to have a man living with you, because they came through your house and they searched. And if they would have found anything belonging to a grown man, they would have took your government funding away from you. So we have to go back and we have to really look at this thing. We have to go back and we have to look at what they really done. See, because nobody is telling you what they really done. And when welfare in Wisconsin, we had generations on top of generations that was on welfare in Wisconsin. And Tommy Thompson, I like what he did. I don't know if he really had a full system that somebody didn't fall through the crack, but I like what he did. And the reason I like what he did, because now we have more of our sisters, listen to what I'm going to say, have more of our sisters that got careers than ever before when he went from welfare to work. Because we was coming back. Grandmama was getting a welfare check. Mama was getting a welfare check. Daughter was getting a welfare check. We got more careers now than ever before. Why? Because he shifted from welfare to work. He was trying to reverse what Lyndon Johnson did. So, and then before he did that, now in 1979, 1980, they gave what's called general assistance. Now, let me help y'all out. General assistance was given to females that didn't have a child and males. And what they did, they gave them $175 plus some food stamps. And they gave them a check every 2 weeks. On the first, they got $105, and on the 15th, they got $70. So every 2 weeks, they was getting a check. So they didn't want to go to work because they was getting a check. Plus, every time their girlfriend had a baby, they got a raise. So the government was giving out good money, but when they gave out that good money, it crippled a lot of people that they didn't want to go to work. So what did they do? After Tommy shift that, then they bring up SSI. And they said your child can get an SSI check if you give them Ritalin. So a lot of parents was giving their children Ritalin, and they got those checks because we were so used of checks. So what we have to do now, we have to reverse. We have to turn things around. We have to let our children dream again. We have to let our children understand that even if you made a mistake and you got a felon, we still live in the greatest country in the world. You can own your own business. You can do whatever you want to do. You can dream again. But only thing is, it's not just going to come to the door. You have to go out and get it. You have to go out and possess the land. See, in church, now this is another thing about the church I'm kind of confused about, because in the church we preach prosperity. In church we tell them to do the Jabez prayers to enlarge their territory. We told them they can prosper, but then when it's election time, we teach them to go vote for their own oppressor. We teach them to go vote for their own oppressor. We don't teach them to go and vote for somebody that got their best interests at heart. What do you want to do? And which candidate can help you do that? Those are the things that we need to do. Those are the things that we have to begin to tap into and to exit. And tap into it, but we also have to exit. We also have to do an exodus. What do I mean by that? Every elected official that haven't done anything for you, it's time to leave them. It's time to get away from them. It's time to stop supporting them. It's time to stop listening to the lies. A lot of our young people don't even understand Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood was put in our community by a woman by the name of Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger was a white racist. Her first attempt was to try to get blacks to get a permit to have a baby. When that didn't work, she birthed out Planned Parenthood. And Planned Parenthood was designed for black genocide. They wanted to wipe us out. Look it up. Everything I'm telling you, look it up. You can find it for yourself. And I had technical difficulties, so I couldn't play this DVD. The name of this DVD is called American History in Black and White. American History in Black and White. Those 7 men that you see on the label are 7 black men that was the first U.S. Congress and U.S. Senator in the 1800s after the Republican Party was founded. The Republican Party was founded in 1854 right here in Ripon, Wisconsin. All right. But you need to look at this. Anybody that want one, let me know. I'll give you one so you can start looking at our history, and not only look at our history, but look where we came from. Look what we went through. Look who really, and it's not about a party right now. And I want y'all to understand that. I just want everybody to have truth. I just want everybody to understand truth. I want everybody to begin to do homework, begin to to do things that was not, how should I say, to undo things that was not right, to redo things so our young people can have a prosperous life, a safe life, because we do got police brutality out here. Not every police officer. I got a lot of my friends that are retired now or still on the force. I got people that's on the sheriff's department. So every police officer is not bad. Every police officer is not bad. So we're not going to sit there and say every last one of them is bad. But here's what I need you guys to do. I need you guys to really begin to ask questions. Why is they pushing me real fast to the polls without giving me any documentation, without showing me what a candidate is really about? Why is my leader who preached to me about against abortion, against same-sex marriage, can address the politics, the election time, to support somebody that they preach against? Those are legitimate questions that you got to ask. Those are legitimate questions. When the pastor's pushing, why are you pushing this? Why we're pushing that? And let me explain this to you for those that are in church that says the church is supposed to stay out of politics. Those of you that say church is supposed to stay out of politics never read Daniel's. You never read about Joseph. You never read about Deborah. You never read about the 3 Hebrew boys. Matter of fact, let me ask this question. When Jesus and Pilate met, and Pilate said to Jesus, I find no fault, what was Pilate saying? What was he saying to Jesus? I find no fault. Because Pilate wasn't dealing with sin. So what was he saying? Because Pilate and Jesus had a political meeting. They had a political meeting where Pilate said to Jesus, I hear you a king. And Jesus said, you heard right. But my kingdom is not of this world. Pilate says, I find no fault, because Jesus was no threat to Caesar. They had a political meeting, and he was no threat to Caesar's. Even Jesus told us, give to Caesar's what's Caesar's, and give unto God what's God. So even though the world system said become 501c3, and when you become 501c3, now you can't talk about politics. But the Bible says give to Caesar's what belongs to Caesar's. But the law says that a church does not have to be 501c3 to take donations. And if a church is not 501c3, it can talk about politics. It can stand in the pulpit. Now, here's a funny thing. Here's a funny thing. All these elections, we heard churches say, well, we can't tell you who to vote for. We can't speak on politics in the church. But this election, the Democrats got the churches preaching message against Trump and literally telling their people who to vote for. Literally telling their people who to vote for. None of the pastors read the Equality Act. None of the pastors read the Equality Act. So let me help y'all out just a little bit what I mean by the Equality Act. I'm going to paint you a picture. Say you at McDonald's with your 5, 6, maybe 7-year-old granddaughter. And she says, I got to use the bathroom. And you walk her to the door and say, okay, go in the bathroom. But what you didn't know was that pedophile was in the bathroom. How did the pedophile get in the women's bathroom? Well, according to the Equality Act bill that they're trying to pass, if a man says, I feel like a woman, he can go into the women's bathroom. And if a pedophile is able to go into a female's bathroom where our little girls go, Ain't nothing you're going to be able to do. You can't say nothing to the managers. You can't say anything because that's discrimination. And that's in that Equality Act bill. You need to go read it. Every church that read that bill will not support Joe Biden. And why not? Because Joe Biden says, first order of business, if I become president, I am going to sign the Equality Act. That's what he said. Look it up. Look it up. Look it up. I just want you guys to do your homework. I just want you guys to be able to see what's really going on. I want you guys to be able to understand what's really going on. I want you guys to be able to understand how to protect your children, how to protect. See, they're already indoctrinating our children with school, and they telling them that two mommies and two daddies is normal. It's normal. So can you imagine when your child go to school and it has a mommy and a daddy in a house? See what was not normal. What now watch this, because it was supposed to be normal that a family have a two-parent household, a mother and a father. That's normal. That's normal in the eyesight of God, and that was supposed to be normal in this world. Mommy and daddy. Well, now they're indoctrinating your children that if your child got a mommy and daddy in the house, he's the oddball because you're supposed to have two mommies or two daddies. So you got to really look at the Equality Act. You got to look at it when the kid go to school and say, no, it's normal to have mommy and daddy. But they're indoctrinating our children, and nobody spiritually paying attention because we're only voting because we got paid. You cannot support nobody if you ain't being paid. I'm not getting paid. That's why I'm not telling y'all I'm not telling y'all to support any party. I'm telling y'all to do the homework. Know what you're doing. The Bible says, my people perish because of lack of knowledge. We're so holy, we know earthly good. We don't know what's going on. And we need to know what's going on. We need to know what's going on in our education system. We need to know what's going on politically. We need to know what's going on in the marketplace. We need to know what's going on in media. We need to know what's going on in arts and entertainment. We need to know what's going on, because if we don't know what's going on, then how can we correct it? We need to know what's going on. We have to make sure that whatever we do, we're supposed to do it as unto the Lord. So that means whoever I'm voting for, I got to make sure that they're in right standing. Now, you're not going to agree with everybody. Everybody's sin and falls short of the glory of God. I get that. We all sin and fall short of the glory of God. I get that. But when you're premeditating your sin, but when you are doing things that you know go against the will of God and then try to justify what you're doing, that's when we got a problem. That's when we have to premeditate it. That's when we got a problem. When I premeditate support a candidate that's going against God, when I premeditate a candidate that's supporting abortion when God's word said thou shalt not steal, and I'm in my pulpit preaching against abortion, but I support a candidate for abortion, then I'm going against what I'm preaching. I'm a hypocrite. I am a hypocrite. If I support a candidate that's going to make laws against God's word when it comes to homosexuality, transgender, then I am a hypocrite. So I have to make sure that whoever I support, there is no perfect candidate, but whoever I support, my moral compass is intact. We have to be real with that, and we have to be honest with that, and we have to look at not just the president race. We have to look at our local race. We're hurting in the city of Milwaukee. People are crying in the city of Milwaukee because their loved ones are dying in the city of Milwaukee. We have elected officials that have checked totally out. Nobody have came out yet to speak on the the murder rate that have surpassed 1993. None of them have came out and spoke about it because they're too busy focusing on an election to get elected a person that is going to do more damage to your lifestyle, your family livelihood than anybody else. All right. Now, I'm also going to let me pull it up because I want to also talk about this that ain't nobody in the city of Milwaukee elected officials are talking about. Let me pull this up because I thought this was a shocking. Y'all can make comments and talk to me. Come on, talk to me. Let me hear what you got to say. Don't just sit there quietly and listen to me. Y'all say something. Now, I wish he was on, and I'm going to get him on so he can break this down for y'all. In the city of Milwaukee, they're talking about giving, or they already done gave it, and I got to get Jason on here, but 420, listen what I'm saying, 420 millions to downtown, 420 million convention center expansion backed by Wisconsin taxpayers. Now, watch this. You issue 420 in debt, but you lost 294, meaning you're 714 in debt, and nobody's saying nothing about this. $417 million in debt in the city of Milwaukee, and nobody's saying nothing about this. No elected official is saying nothing about this. Nobody opening their mouth about this. If Jason Fields was the comptroller, y'all Channel 6 would have said something. Channel 12 would have said something. 58 would have said something. Channel 4 would have said something. CNN would have said something. But ain't nobody opening their mouths to $714 million in debt. And guess who's going to pay it? Us taxpayers. Nobody's saying anything. Nobody is saying anything. Let me see if I can text him to see if he can come on here and explain this, because nobody is saying nothing. None of our elected officials is saying anything. None of them. None of them. And if Jason Fields wouldn't have posted, we wouldn't know. We wouldn't have known. We knew about the 420, but we didn't know about the 294. That's sad, Milwaukee. That is really sad that they are doing this to us. That's really sad. That's really, how should I say this? Embarrassing for us to go through this and nobody's saying anything because they don't care about the people. When are y'all going to understand they do not care about the people? When are y'all going to realize? When are y'all going to open up and open up your eyes? When are y'all going to say things that make them realize that they can't keep doing this to us? When are y'all going to realize that? When are y'all going to do homework to see about the education system in our city and where the money really goes? When are we going to understand that we are being bamboozled? We are being screwed. We are being dogged out by so-called people that says they support us and said that they want to take care of us. When are we going to take a look at that? When are we going to say something about those kind of issues that is going on in our city right now. Because the sad part about it is this. The sad part about it is this. If we don't say nothing, they're not going to change nothing. Now, watch this. I watched the so-called news conference, Souls to the Polls. And this is what they said. If we can vote out Trump and put Biden in, then we get our city back. Then we get a better Milwaukee. And I paused for a minute. I didn't make a comment on that post, but I paused for a minute. And then I said, wow, really? The person you're trying to push in belongs to the same party that's in charge of our city. The same person you're trying to vote in been there 47 years. How long our city been hurting? The president is not going to fix Milwaukee. We have to fix Milwaukee locally. And we need to stop letting them lie to us. Until we get rid of those that are in office now that got us in this mess, ain't nothing changing. Nothing is going to change for none of us. It's going to always stay the same. It's going to always stay the same. Now, when we look at let's see. Because I really want you guys to understand me, that I am not here to push anybody today, but I am here that you guys will begin to do homework and that you guys will think. And I'm only loyal to my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. I'm an ambassador for the government of the kingdom of heaven. So I'm going to tell you the truth as an ambassador, because an ambassador cannot give you his opinion. He only can give you what his government has already said. So I only will give you what my government has already said. I'm not going to give you my opinion. When I look up and I give you facts, I tell you exactly what they say. So let me look up some stuff and let's see exactly what is being said. All right, because I don't want to give you anything of my own. All right, I don't want to give you anything of my own. I want to give you pieces of, I'm gonna just break it down, because what I couldn't do, I wasn't able to bring it up that way. But I know I can bring it up this way. Wait a minute, 1 second. Let's see.
In the fierce battles of the Revolutionary War that birthed our nation, both black and white soldiers often fought side.
Okay, listen to this. Let me just go back. This is called American Heritage Series, episode 22, Great Black Patriots, Part 1 by David Barton. Listen.
In the fierce battles of the Revolutionary War that birthed our nation, both black and white soldiers often fought side by side. Why then do our classrooms seem to neglect the account of so many of our nation's great black leaders? And what spiritual beliefs and influences shape the love?
Sam, can you hear that pretty good? Send me a message if you can hear. Whoever listening, just text in that you can hear it real good, because I really want the audience to be able to hear this. So if you was able to hear that, just text, yes, I can hear it. So that way I can continue, because I really want us to hear this. And I want y'all to be able to listen to this because it's really important that we know truth. Wait, I can test it.
Lives of these great black men and women. Discover the forgotten and astonishing story of our nation's foundation in the American Heritage Series. For centuries, Americans were taught a truthful view of history that recognized the godly heroes and the moral foundation our nation was founded upon. But in recent years, a new version of history has assaulted the moral and spiritual fiber of our nation, leaving the truth of our past eliminated and forgotten until today. Join historian David Barton and experience the untold story of our nation's history in the American Heritage Series.
The richest parts of American history is in Black history, and yet today, so many of us know so little about it.
Many of our greatest revolutionary heroes were patriots of African descent.
We have so many cool stories of black and white serving together, fighting together in the Revolution, and yet what we hear today are the real victim stories, which are there. No question there, but that's only a part of American history.
Many courageous and effective black leaders played pivotal roles in our government as early as the late 1800s.
If you're going to talk about African-American heroes, by and large, you're going to have to talk about some Christians. And since we don't talk about Christians in textbooks, African-Americans really receive the brunt of that.
What is the story and inspiration behind these great patriots and heroes of the faith? And why have so many of their stories remained silent? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage Series. America, this is your heritage.
America has a rich history full of heroes of all types, but the ones we hear the least about are African-American heroes. African-American heroes have been part of American history from the very beginning. Our tendency in textbooks today is when we tell about Black history, we start in the 1960s and move forward.
Right.
And that's an important era of history. Dr. Martin Luther King and all the things that went with that, the March to Selma, the March on D.C., it's all important. But that's not where Black history starts.
Right.
We have some real heroes of Black history that we can take way back to the beginning. Great example is Richard Allen. Richard Allen is an African-American who became the founder of the first Black denomination in America. His is a great story. He was raised as a slave in Delaware, living as a slave on a plantation in Delaware. And a Methodist evangelist came riding across that plantation preaching the gospel. Richard Allen hears the gospel. He gives his life to Christ, becomes not only a Christian, he becomes a zealous Christian. Richard Allen started sharing Christ with everything that moved on that plantation. And shortly, the slave master became a Christian. The slave master says, "What am I doing owning slaves?" So Richard gets his freedom. Well, Richard wants to keep preaching the gospel. So he walks out of that.
Okay. Many of us don't even know who Richard Allen is. Because why? Because it's not told to us. You should listen to this and then look it up for yourself and allow your children to listen to this. Give them some real good American history. Let's listen some more.
Plantation, walks out of Delaware, going north. He ends up in Philadelphia. And Philadelphia at that time was the nation's third largest city. There were 40,000 people in Philadelphia. You can imagine that being the nation's third largest city. Richard ends up preaching in a church in Philadelphia where he's preaching to 2,000 people a week. Now, that's a mega church today, but that's really a mega church. Oh, and by the way, it was a white church that he was pastoring back then. Oh, wait, they didn't do that back then? Oh, yeah. There are so many examples of black and white together in early American history. There's definitely racial conflict as you go through parts of history, but there was so much cooperation that we never hear about. And so Richard Allen, great patriot that he is, actually becomes one of the soldiers in the American Revolution. So here's a pastor. He's a soldier in the American Revolution. He gets hooked up with signer of the Declaration, Dr. Benjamin Rush. So here's an Anglo, here's an African-American. They're working together. It's those two guys that formed the first black denomination in America. The AME denomination was founded by a black and a white working together. Then if you take that relationship, move forward a little bit, what you find is the period of what's called the yellow fever epidemic. The yellow fever epidemic of Philadelphia was 1793. It was terrible. No one knew what caused yellow fever back then. And so it terrorized everyone because they were losing about 120 people a day in the city to yellow fever. They were just dying off. 1/10 of the city died in that period of time. There were about 70 doctors in the city. They all left the city because they're scared to death. They're going to get yellow fever. They don't know what causes it. Well, Dr. Benjamin Rush was one of the very few who stayed in the city. He's called the father of American medicine. And the two guys that worked with him to treat yellow fever, the three of them that worked together to service that whole city, you had Dr. Benjamin Rush signed the declaration, but you had Richard Allen, and you had another black pastor, Absalom Jones. Absalom Jones is the first black bishop in the Episcopal Church, and those three guys treated so much of Philadelphia. So there you've got this huge crisis going on, and what do you have? You have a white, two blacks working side by side to treat that epidemic. Great story of American history, great story of medicine, but we just don't hear it.
Although the history of black Americans begins in 1619 with the arrival of the first slaves in America, the political history of black Americans actually begins in the year 1787, the year in which the American political system was constructed. 1787 was the year the Constitution was written. Today, many critics assert that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document, and to prove this, they point to the 3/5 clause, claiming that the Constitution says that blacks are only 3/5 of a person. One of the earliest black Americans to investigate this claim was the famous abolitionist Frederick Douglass. Douglass had been born into slavery and remained a slave until he escaped to New York. 3 years after his escape, he delivered an anti-slavery speech in Massachusetts. He was promptly hired to work for the state's anti-slavery society, and he also served as a preacher at Zion Methodist Church. During Douglass's first years in freedom in the North, he studied at the feet of abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, who taught him that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document. Douglass accepted this claim, and his early speeches and writings reflected that belief. However, Douglass later began to research the issue for himself. He read the Constitution. He read the writings of those who wrote the Constitution, and what he found revolutionized his thinking. He concluded that the Constitution was not a pro-slavery document, but rather it was an anti-slavery document. But if the Constitution is not pro-slavery, then what about the 3/5 clause? Had Douglass not read that clause? Yes, he had. He understood that the 3/5 clause dealt only with representation and not the worth of any person. You see, the Constitution had established that for every 30,000 inhabitants in a state, that state would receive one representative to Congress. The southern states saw this as an opportunity to strengthen slavery. Slaves accounted for much of the southern population. In fact, almost half the inhabitants of South Carolina were slaves. Therefore, slave owners could simply count their slaves as regular inhabitants, and by so doing could almost double the number of their pro-slavery representatives to Congress. Of course, the anti-slavery leaders from the North strenuously objected to this. After all, slave owners did not consider their slaves to be persons, but only property. These slave owners were therefore using their property, that is, their slaves, to increase the power of the slave states in Congress. The anti-slavery leaders fully wanted free blacks counted, but not slaves, if counting slaves would increase the power of slave owners. They understood that the fewer the pro-slavery representatives to Congress, the sooner slavery could be eradicated from the nation. Several other founders, including James Wilson and Elbridge Gerry, even used the slaveholders' own arguments against them. For example, Luther Martin proposed,
if slaves are considered property, then what renders this property different from any other type of property? That is, why should slaves as property be taken into account rather than horses, cattle, mules, or any other type of property?
These anti-slavery founders argued that if the South was going to count its property, that is, its slaves, in order to get more pro-slavery representation in Congress, then the North would count its property, that is, its houses, cows, and horses, to get more anti-slavery representation in Congress. Of course, the South objected just as strongly to this proposal as the North had objected to counting slaves. The final compromise was that only 60% of slaves, that is, 3/5 of slaves, would be counted to calculate the number of Southern representatives to Congress. In other words, it would take 50,000 slaves rather than just 30,000 before slave-holding states could get a representative in Congress, thus greatly reducing the number of representatives to Congress from states with extraordinarily large slave populations. This, then, is the 3/5 clause. It had nothing to do with the worth of any individual. In fact, free blacks in the North and the South often were extended the full rights of a citizen and regularly voted, both in the North and the South. The 3/5 clause had to do only with representation. This is why Frederick Douglass, unlike many today who have never taken time to study the Constitution, could emphatically declare that the Constitution, all of the Constitution, was anti-slavery.
Many of our greatest revolutionary heroes were patriots of African descent. Many courageous and effective black leaders played pivotal roles in our government as early as the late 1800s. What is the story and inspiration behind these great patriots and heroes of the faith, and why have so many of their stories remained silent? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
So some of y'all probably hearing this for the first time about all of what took place. Some of y'all for the first time hearing about the real thing about the 3/5 clause. Some of y'all didn't even realize during yellow fever that we had 2 black men working with 1 white man to nurture and take care of people through that pandemic. So they had a pandemic back there, y'all, called the yellow fever. And we had 2 blacks and a white working together. But y'all don't get that. And our kids don't get those kind of stories. Because why? They don't want you to know where we really come from. And they don't want you to understand how powerful that we are. Now, you can look it up. It's called American Heritage Series. And this is episode 22. Great Black Patriots, Part 1. So now, these are the things that we need to teach our children. These are the things that we need to listen to them, what they're saying. And so when we're doing this, we need to be able to tell everything. We need to be able to share everything. And this is why I do what I do, because I want you to be able to hear a neutral person. This is not a black man saying this. This is a white man by the name of David Barton that is bringing this history, so that way they can't water it down if a black man brought it. Y'all know how they love to discredit us, but this is a white man that's bringing it. And so when we understand this, let's look at some of it from part 2.
In the fierce battles of the Revolutionary War that birthed our nation, both black and white soldiers often fought side by side. Why then do our classrooms seem to neglect the account of so many of our nation's great black leaders? What is the story and inspiration behind the early civil rights movement? And did the pastors and religious leaders of America play a role in the abolition of slavery? And what spiritual beliefs and influences shaped the lives of these great black men and women? Discover the forgotten and astonishing story of our nation's foundation in the American Heritage series. For centuries, Americans were taught a truthful view of history that recognized the godly heroes and moral foundation our nation was founded upon. But in recent years, a new version of history has assaulted the moral and spiritual fiber of our nation, leaving the truth of our past eliminated and forgotten. Until today, join historian David Barton and experience the untold story of our nation's history in the American Heritage series.
When God tells history in the Bible, he doesn't gloss it up. He tells it just the way that it happened. He tells the good, the bad, the ugly.
Many of our greatest revolutionary heroes were patriots of African descent.
There's no way you can separate political parties from black history unless you want to be politically incorrect, and then that requires a sacrifice of the truth. And I'm not going to do that.
Many courageous and effective black leaders played pivotal roles in our government as early as the late 1800s.
Nearly every Southern Republican Party was started by blacks, not whites.
What is the story and inspiration behind these great patriots and heroes of the faith? And why have so many of their stories remained silent? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage Series. America, this is your heritage.
The history of Black Americans begins in 1619 when the first load of slaves sailed up the James River into Jamestown, Virginia. Slavery introduced into America. The first history of African Americans is involuntary. For the next 150 years, Black American history is really centered around the states because we don't have a nation, we don't have any kind of a national government. It's very much like it would have been in Europe. All the different states were really like nations. So the first real concerted national effort to end slavery occurs with the beginning of the national government. The first efforts to end slavery really began in 1787 when they had the Constitutional Convention. All the states have come together and they're trying to figure out how do we have a nation now. And within that group, you had some pro-slavery, you had a lot of anti-slavery. Right. Overwhelming majority of states were anti-slavery, but some were pro-slavery. But again, they were just states back then, so they couldn't affect their neighbor. They could end it in their state, and they did. When we signed the Declaration of Independence, a number of states started wiping out slavery right then. We had to have slavery before that because the king would not allow us to end slavery. Well, now that we separate from Great Britain, we can end slavery. So here you have Massachusetts, and you have Vermont, you have Connecticut, all these states ended slavery. Now they're in this federal constitutional convention with some states that are pro-slavery, with a whole bunch that are anti-slavery. There was a lot of fight that went over that. One of the clauses in the Constitution to which critics today point to say slavery is part of the Constitution, always had been, it's part of the national psyche, always been this attitude of enslaving African Americans. They point to what's called the 3/5 clause. The 3/5 clause was actually an anti-slavery clause that was put in the Constitution. But we never hear that today. We never hear that 3/5 was anti-slavery. But it's interesting, the testimony of those who would know best, the ones that I would look to if I wanted to know what African Americans thought about the 3/5 clause, I'd go to somebody like Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, great civil rights leader. We know him from back around 1838. He escaped from slavery and he went to New York. And as he was against slavery in New York, the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society heard him speak and said, oh, you need to go on the road full time and speak against slavery. So here's Frederick Douglass, who had been in Maryland a slave, has now escaped to the North. He's free. So he goes on the road full time to speak against slavery. Now, interestingly, in the 2 years that he was in New York, what's called the radical abolitionists were the ones who trained him. And they said the Constitution is a pro-slavery document. It is filled with the founding fathers' desire to keep slavery. He had been trained in that for 2 years. But when he agreed to go on the road full time for the Massachusetts Abolition Society, he had the integrity to say, you know, I've been taught about these documents, but I better read them for myself. Wow. And so he went back and read the documents. He read the debates. He read all the things that went on. In his autobiography, he said that he underwent a radical change of opinion. Instead of finding that the documents were pro-slavery, he said he found them to be anti-slavery in every provision. He said, by the way, if they are pro-slavery, why does the word slave or slavery, why does none of that appear anywhere in the Constitution? And they don't appear. In the 1860 presidential election, there was a split in the Democratic Party, the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats. Both factions supported slavery, but while Southern Democrats were willing to split the United States to form their own nation, Northern Democrats refused to do so. Northern Democrats voted for Stephen Douglas for president, while Southern Democrats voted for John C. Breckinridge. With this split in the Democratic vote, Republican Abraham Lincoln was then elected with only 40% of the popular vote, but 59% of the Electoral College vote. Republicans also won a majority in the U.S. House and Senate in that election, thus giving Republicans control of the lawmaking process for the very first time. Given the bold anti-slavery and pro-civil rights positions set forth by Republicans in their platforms, it was obvious to Democrats what was about to occur. The anti-slavery and pro-civil rights position of the Republicans were about to become reality. What was the Democratic response? Southern Democrats left Congress and took their states with them, forming a nation that described itself as the slave-holding Confederate States of America. While Northern Democrats did not support secession, they nonetheless generally supported slavery and opposed civil rights for Black Americans. In short, the main difference between Southern and Northern Democrats at that time was their view on secession, not slavery. However, returning to the election of 1860, with Republicans firmly in control of the federal government, they quickly began implementing significant changes. In 1862, Republicans abolished slavery in Washington, D.C.
And in 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, freeing all slaves in the southern states in rebellion. The Emancipation Proclamation was eagerly anticipated, and many Black Americans gathered in groups around clocks or watches, eagerly awaiting the arrival of midnight on December the 31st, 1862, for the proclamation was to take effect on the first moment of January the 1st, 1863. Frederick Douglass was in attendance at one such midnight rally, waiting for the proclamation to become official. When that moment arrived, a celebration erupted, and Douglass exclaimed,
"It was one of the most affecting and thrilling occasions I ever witnessed, and a worthy celebration of the first step on the part of the nation in its departure from the bondage of the ages."
In 1860, in that election where the Democrats had their platforms and Dred Scott's great Republicans had theirs, says, no, it's not. You had the election that time between the Democrats and the Republicans. Abraham Lincoln running as a Republican. The Democrats actually broke and split. There was the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats. The Southern Democrats said slavery is absolutely fine and we're willing to leave the Union if these Republicans try to end slavery. You had the Northern Democrats up through New York and elsewhere that said, we think slavery is fine, but we're not willing to break up the Union over it. So when he gets elected, the Southern Democrats said, we told you we're going to leave if he gets elected, because if he gets elected, he's promised to end slavery. So you had 11 Democrat states secede from the Union. Now, we now say the South seceded from the North. No. Every Southern Democrat in the House, every Southern Democrat in the Senate left and started a new nation. I have the founding documents of that nation. They called it the slave-holding nation of the Confederacy. That's in their title. The speech given by their vice president, Alexander Stephens, said that slavery is the cornerstone of the Southern Confederacy. So you have 11 states that have broken away to have a slave nation. That's what the Civil War is about. So now Republicans, in one election, not only was Abraham Lincoln elected, but Republicans took the House and the Senate in one election. So within 7 years, they've gone to be a majority party. They started cranking out civil rights laws like crazy. This is one of the early civil rights laws. This is a law to secure equality before the courts. In other words, race no longer had anything to do with the courts. It was prior to this that if you were black, you couldn't testify in court. You couldn't go before a court to bring a suit. You were excluded from the legal process. Here's a bill that's designed to give equal pay for soldiers. If you're black or if you're white, you're going to get paid the same.
What are the dates of these?
This bill is 1864. This is March the 5th of 1864.
And is that an original?
That's the original. This is the original as introduced in the Senate. This is Senate Bill 145. And this is the original Senate bill. Here's the House bill. This is H.R. 51. This is the bill that created the Freedmen's Bureau, another civil rights bill. So Republicans are cranking out civil rights bills like crazy.
Many of our greatest revolutionary heroes were patriots of African descent. Many courageous and effective black leaders played pivotal roles in our government as early as the late 1800s. What is the story and inspiration behind these great patriots and heroes of the faith, and why have so many of their stories remained silent? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage Series. America, this is your heritage.
Now, I just want to say that you guys can get this and watch it with your children on YouTube. You can go to Wall Builders and you can order it and buy it. They got a lot of Black history there, you know. And the thing about this, again, I'm not trying to persuade anybody to a party. I'm trying to get truth out there. I want you to be able to look it up for yourself. I want you to be able to get in the habit of studying, that you may have facts and that you can give them to your children and to your grandchildren. This is powerful. We never got this in school. I never heard about any of this on Black History Month. Never have anybody shared this with me on Black History Month. I never got it. Some of y'all never got it either, you know, and they still not giving it to our children. So it's our responsibility to break it down. Let's listen to some more.
There was indeed a clear difference between the philosophy of the Republicans and of Democrats on the issue of race and racial equality. Southern Democrats had been willing to form an entire nation on the foundation of white supremacy, and there was no doubt that the South was strongly Democratic. as a leading South Carolina Democrat testified during an 1871 congressional hearing.
For the purposes of this hearing, sir, could you provide a breakdown along party lines as exists in your state?
Southern Democrats have been willing to form an
Almost
entire
999 out of 1,000 of the decent people of South Carolina belong to the Democratic Party. The Republican Party is composed entirely of the colored people.
When it came time for the presidential election of 1864, Southern Democrats were still fighting against the Union. Therefore, the presidential candidate for the Democrats that year was a Northern Democrat, Union General George B. McClellan. McClellan was actually running for president against his own commander-in-chief, but there was a clear difference between the two. In fact, Abraham Lincoln had twice replaced McClellan for failing to obey Lincoln's orders to launch aggressive attacks against the Confederacy. And not surprisingly, the anti-black tone of this Northern Democrat shone through in his presidential campaign. For example, examine this 1864 campaign piece for General McClellan. Why does he urge citizens to vote for him? Because, as he explains,
our bloody Civil War has now lasted nearly 4 years under the mismanagement of Abraham Lincoln. Nearly 1 million white men have been sacrificed.
Notice another of his complaints.
Lincoln has declared his intention to convert the Civil War into a war for forcible abolition and Negro equality, social and political.
According to McClellan, since white lives were being lost, and since Republicans were seeking both abolition and Negro equality, McClellan argues that he, as a Democrat, should be elected so that he could halt those policies. Republicans also took clear positions in that 1864 presidential campaign. The 1864 Republican platform therefore called for a constitutional amendment to completely abolish slavery, and work was begun in Congress almost immediately on that amendment. That same year, President Lincoln won re-election to a second term. It was in 1865 that the Civil War finally came to a close. The nation of slaveholding states had been defeated. President Lincoln and the black troops of the 29th Connecticut Regiment visited Richmond, the former capital of the Confederate States of America. An officer in that black regiment recorded the scene.
As the president passed along the street, the colored people waved their handkerchiefs, hats, and bonnets and expressed their gratitude by shouting repeatedly, "Thank God for his goodness. We have seen his salvation." The white soldiers caught the sound and swelled the numbers, cheering as they marched along. All could see the president. He was so tall. One woman shouted, "Thank you, dear Jesus, for this sight of the great conqueror." No wonder tears came to the president's eyes when he looked on the poor colored people who were once slaves and heard the blessing uttered from thankful hearts and thanksgiving to God and Jesus. Thousands of colored men in Richmond would have laid down their lives for President Lincoln.
You're proving to us the mindset of founding fathers.
Yes.
We're moving into the mid-1800s, but the intent and the original intent based upon fact of original documents sitting right here on this set right now.
Well, that's why they call themselves the Republican Party. They want to go back to the original intent. They want to go back to the founding. And so they believe all of these laws were consistent with what the founders had tried to do in those early laws.
Wow.
So this is a reflection of original intent, even though it's 70 years later.
We had moved away 70, 80 years. We had moved really far away from the original intent of the founding fathers, and this was a correction of that pendulum.
That's right.
Yeah.
That 35 years in Congress from 1820 to 1854, 1855, Democrats were reversing a lot of the early laws. They said, George Washington said, no slavery in federal territories. We don't like that law. 1808, at that time, under Thomas Jefferson, Congress passed this law that said no more slave trade. We don't like that law. So they went through and take all these laws that were passed early federal Congresses by the founding fathers and said, we disagree with all that. We're going a different direction.
Wow.
So it's a complete reversal. So the Republican Party says, no, we're going back to the principles of the Republic. That's why they call themselves Republican Party. So there was a period of time we got away. Now we're headed back. And significantly, we come to an election in 1864 while we're still at war. Now, what's interesting is all these Southern Democrats have seceded and formed their own state.
So it's going to be pretty easy to guess who's going to win the election. I mean, the Republicans now have the majority because they're still in the Union. This is a significant document right here. It's a very delicate document, if I can pick it up. This is a platform of the Republicans and the Democrats in 1864. That little jewel right there says for the Republican platform and the Democrat platform. But what makes this significant, this is the first document to call for a constitutional amendment to end slavery. Oh my God. See what happened? They said, well, we're passing all these civil rights laws, but it's just taking too long. Let's just get a constitutional amendment and stop this thing right now.
And what year was that?
This is 1864. You see, what happened as a result of this election, Republicans got back in power, and they promptly introduced the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery. So they're put back in power, they promised to do it, and they introduced the 13th Amendment, and significantly, they voted on the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery while the Civil War is still going on. So we're talking in January and February of 1865, they have the vote in the House and the Senate to abolish slavery. Now, at that time, there were 200 members of Congress, Democrat and Republican, because at that time, you still had all the Northern Democrats in. So all the Northern Democrats are still in Congress. Southern Democrats have their own nation now. Northern Democrats still in. So you get Northern Democrats and Republicans, 200 members of Congress. 137 members voted to abolish slavery. When they voted, shortly after the vote, this was produced nationally. This right here is a picture of all 137 members of Congress who voted to abolish slavery. Everyone. And it's got Abraham Lincoln right at the center because he was leading the charge on the 13th Amendment. Now, under the Constitution, a president has no role in a constitutional amendment. Wow. The president does nothing. This is the only constitutional amendment in American history signed by a president of the United States. He did it symbolically to say, I know I've got nothing to do with passing the amendment officially, but I want you to know I'm behind this. So he signed it. Now, at that time, you had 118 members of Congress that were Republican. You had 82 members of Congress that were Democrat. As it turns out, 118 out of 118 Republicans voted to end slavery. Only 19 out of 82 Northern Democrats voted to end slavery. So that's why you only have 137. You see, you have 23% of Democrats in the North who want to end slavery. 3/4 didn't, but you have 100% of Republicans who want to end slavery. So the 13th Amendment is passed. It goes to the states. It is ratified.
Many of our greatest revolutionary heroes were patriots of African descent. Many courageous and effective black leaders played pivotal roles in our government as early as the late 1800s. What is the story and inspiration behind these great patriots and heroes of the faith, and why have so many of their stories remained silent? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage Series. America, this is your heritage.
When the vote had been taken in copy.
All right, let me stop it for a second. This is so important. It's not about parties right now. This is about history of the black community, the black Americans that went through that our young people don't know nothing about. So I'm urging you to either two things: go look it up, or have them watch this show with you, so they can know history. Because we need to know the history. We need to know history of where we come from. We need to know history that we were more involved in our country than just being slaves. I mean, our young people need to know this history. So this is why I'm playing this. This is why I'm trying to get it out to you guys. So I want you guys to really just listen to the history of our history of great black patriots in this country. So let's listen to some more.
Congress on the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery, the chambers had been packed from wall to wall with expectant observers. When the numbers were counted and it was announced that the amendment had passed, a roar erupted from the thousands in the chamber. Hats were thrown and voices were raised in exuberant cheers. Congress had voted to end slavery. How should something that profound be celebrated? Members of the House asked that a sermon be preached to commemorate the event. And whom did they ask to preach the sermon? The Reverend Henry Highland Garnett. Garnett became the first African American to speak in the halls of Congress, and he delivered this sermon. Today, it may sound strange to hear that there was a sermon preached in the Capitol. In fact,
On December the 4th, 1800, shortly after Congress first moved into the Capitol building, Congress authorized that on Sundays, the Capitol would be used for church services. By 1867, the largest church in Washington, D.C. was the one that met inside the U.S. Capitol. Reverend Garnett preached this sermon on Sunday, February the 12th, 1865, and it was powerful. He began that sermon with a recollection of his own personal experiences.
What is slavery? Too well do I know what it is. I was born among the cherished institutions of slavery. My earliest recollection of parents, friends, and the home of my childhood are clouded with its wrongs. The first sight that met my eyes was my Christian mother enslaved.
Garnett then reviewed the prominent historical leaders of both church and state who had strongly opposed slavery.
The other day, when the light of liberty streamed through this marble building and the hearts of a noble band of patriotic statesmen leaped for joy, in this, our national capital, shook, foundation to dome, with the shouts of a ransomed people. Then methinks the spirits of Washington, Jefferson, the Jays, the Adams, Franklin, and Lafayette, Giddings, and Lovejoy, and those of all the mighty and glorious dead remembered by history because they were faithful to truth, justice, and liberty, were hovering over this august assembly. Though unseen by mortal eyes, doubtless they joined the angelic choir and said, Amen!
So now for states to come back in to the United States, these 11 southern states that broke away to have a slave nation to get back in, this is the oath of loyalty you had to take to get back in to the United States. To come into the United States, you have to swear before Almighty God, number one, that you will obey the laws pertaining to civil rights and slavery and the new constitutional amendments, and two, that you'll uphold the Constitution of the United States, which now has the 13th Amendment in it. And by the way, to show you how serious they took the oath, they didn't take an oath on the Bible. They didn't just raise the right hand and say, so help me God. They take an oath on the holy evangelist of Almighty God. You see, we know that when we put our hands on the Bible, we're putting it on the Gospels. That's Jesus Christ. We claim to be a Christian nation. We're swearing on Jesus Christ, whom we claim to follow, that we will obey the Constitution, and we're swearing on the Gospels that we will obey the civil rights laws. This was a serious oath. I mean, this is the official document put up by the United States, and you're swearing on the holy evangelist of Almighty God. Now, the various states would put out this document as well. But I mean, this is part of our history. So because of the 13th Amendment, for the first time, African Americans across the South are free. Now, they were freed in the Emancipation Proclamation, but South is pretty much ignoring that. So now we got a constitutional amendment, and you're swearing you're going to uphold the Constitution. So now you got to recognize blacks are free. Because they were free, they could register to vote. They started registering to vote. They started electing blacks to office across the South like crazy. Because of the 13th Amendment and the end of slavery, Black Americans, particularly in the South, could now enjoy their first real taste of civil rights, their first genuine opportunity for political participation. Within a year, blacks were registering to vote and were forming political parties across the South. For example, at a rally in Houston, Texas, on July the 4th, 1867, 150 blacks and 20 whites formed the Republican Party of Texas. And Black Americans also started other Southern Republican parties as well. For a few years, Republicans became the political majority in most of the Southern states. Those Republican legislatures moved quickly to protect voting rights for African Americans, prohibit segregation, establish public education, and open public transportation, state police, schools, and other institutions to Black Americans. Not only were the Southern legislatures at that time Republican, but at least for a few years, nearly every Southern legislature included many Black legislators. In fact, the first 42 blacks elected to the state legislature in Texas were all Republicans. And in Louisiana, the first 95 Black representatives and the first 32 Black senators were, again, all Republicans. Similarly, in Alabama, the first 103 blacks elected to the state legislature were all Republicans. In Mississippi, the
First 112 black legislators were Republicans. In South Carolina, the first 190. In Virginia, the first 46. In Florida, the first 30. And the same in North Carolina. And in Georgia, 41 blacks were elected to the state legislature, all as Republicans. The Republican Party of Texas was founded in Houston on the 4th of July, 1867, 150 blacks and 20 whites. Nearly every Southern Republican Party was started by blacks, not whites. Well, of course, in those states, they're opposing this, that the racists are really out. Democrats are saying this is not fair. And because they would not recognize the civil rights laws, even though they swore to do so, that's why the 14th Amendment was passed. 14th Amendment says every freed slave now has the rights of citizenship of every other citizen. Because in the South, southern states are saying, well, those blacks might be freed, but they're sure not citizens of our state. Well, the 14th Amendment says, well, yes, they are. Any right of citizen. And because of the 14th Amendment, we can now elect blacks to the federal Congress. These guys right here. That's the first 7 blacks elected to the federal Congress, right there. This guy is the first black U.S. Senator, Hiram Rhodes Rebels. Oh, dare I say, he's a preacher of the gospel. He was a missionary. He was a chaplain in the Civil War. He raised 3 black regiments for the Union Civil War. He went on to become the president of Alcorn College. And over on this side, really cool guys, Robert Brown Elliott, Joseph Hayne Rainey. Joseph Hayne Rainey, by the way, is the first black elected to the House of Representatives. He actually served as Speaker of the House. A black served as Speaker, yeah. All 7 of these guys are Republicans. Matter of fact, the first 23 blacks elected to the federal Congress were all Republicans. Now, you want to get embarrassed, there is a great website called Neglected Voices. Neglected Voices are the speeches of the first 23 blacks who served in Congress. Now, half of these guys have been educated in a 5-year period, and they were self-educated. They taught themselves. I'm embarrassed to read those speeches because it takes me a dictionary to understand what they're saying. Their word level, their vocabulary level, their syntax, sentence structure, way over anything I would ever think about saying or doing. I get so inspired reading these guys. I mean, here they are. 5 years ago, they're slaves. Now they're members of Congress, and you read their speeches, and it'll throw you through the roof. It'll lift you right off your chair to see what these guys did. 4 of these guys became university presidents. Half of them became teachers. Several were pastors. I mean, it's unbelievable what these guys did in a short period of time. Wow. We never hear that today. So that aspect of American history that deals with ending slavery and starting forward progress for African Americans, wonderful time in history, filled with wonderful individuals who fought. There's a lot of tragedy involved, but there's a lot of victory involved. And these guys are representative of that time. It's a wonderful time in American history.
All right. I'm going to let you listen to part 3. That was what you was listening to was episode 23. Part 2, episode 23. And this is some of the history that you guys can go and take a look at to know what's really, really going on. Let me see if I can get episode 24, because I want you to hear there's so much more I want you to hear about this, because of the fact that these are the things that we have not been talking about, or have not been taught, or even we didn't even know about. Okay, here's 24.
In the fierce battles of the Revolutionary War that birthed our nation, both black and white soldiers often fought side by side. Why then do our classrooms seem to neglect the account of so many of our nation's great black leaders? And what spiritual beliefs and influences shape the lives of these great black men and women? Discover the forgotten and astonishing story of our nation's foundation in the American Heritage series. For centuries, Americans were taught a truthful view of history that recognized the godly heroes and moral foundation our nation was founded upon. But in recent years, a new version of history has assaulted the moral and spiritual fiber of our nation, leaving the truth of our past eliminated and forgotten. Until today, Join historian David Barton and experience the untold story of our nation's history in the American Heritage Series.
The whole Black history aspect, it's a very partisan thing, but we hear nothing about it, but it is so well documented.
Many of our greatest revolutionary heroes were patriots of African descent.
Why is it so many blacks were the victims of the Klan? It's real simple. If you were black in America, you were Republican back then.
Many courageous and effective black leaders played pivotal roles in our government as early as the late 1800s.
Had it not been for Republicans, the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65 would not have passed.
What is the story and inspiration behind these great patriots and heroes of the faith? And why have so many of their stories remained silent? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage Series. America, this is your heritage.
African American history has been a steady procession of progress, but so much of that progress really began to accelerate in the era that we call Reconstruction. That's where you have the introduction of the first civil rights amendments to the Constitution. The first civil rights constitutional amendment was done in 1865. That was the 13th Amendment. It abolished slavery. It was done during the Civil War. It was a very partisan amendment.
Right.
In that amendment, you had 100% of Republicans who voted to end slavery. You only had 23% of Democrats who wanted to end slavery. Right after that amendment was done, we come to the end of the Civil War. So now the South, that had really separated to form a pro-slavery nation, and that's not my opinion, that is their secession documents.
Right.
The documents of secession of the South, of those 11 states that seceded, said that they did so to preserve slavery. The Confederate Constitution actually totally prohibits any state from ending slavery. That's how set they were on keeping slavery, is they're claiming states' rights, but they won't even allow their own states to end slavery. So they're very adamant on that. The speech, one of the early speeches in the Confederacy given by the Vice President, Alexander Stephens, called slavery the cornerstone of the Confederacy. And it literally was. So you get to the end of the Civil War shortly after you abolish slavery. And now you've got all these states who separated to have slavery, and they've got to come back into the Union somehow. But you've got to convince them that if you're going to get back in, you have to do so upholding the 13th Amendment. Slavery's got to be over. Well, they wouldn't. They said, all right, so what? You freed all the slaves, but they're not going to be citizens of our state. We're not going to let them be citizens of Louisiana or Georgia or Texas or whatever. So Congress says, oh, let's do a little arm twisting here. So they come up with the 14th Amendment that says that a freed slave is a citizen of the state in which he lives. So what had happened was in the South, you had two types of citizens. You had state citizens and you had others just living there. Free blacks who can't be citizens. Federal Constitution says, no, that stops right now. You live in a state, you're a citizen of that state, that's the end of it. So that when it came time to vote on that in the federal Congress. Now, remember, after the Civil War, the Southern Democrats have now joined back to the Union. So we had the Northern Democrats, we had the Southern Democrats, we had the Republicans. They're all back together. And so they're back in Congress now. Northern and Southern Democrats and Republicans. Comes time to vote on the 14th Amendment that says that these former slaves get civil rights. Not a single Democrat in Congress voted for the 14th Amendment. Not a single, it's a matter of public record, not a single one.
What year was that?
That was 1868. You still have trouble in the southern states. There's a lot going on that says, well, they may be citizens, but we're going to pass laws that say that colors of citizens can't vote. You can't have blacks vote. So Congress came in 1870 and passed the 15th Amendment that says you cannot be deprived of your right to vote on the basis of your color. Real simple stuff. It's a reaction to what's going on in the southern states. The 15th Amendment is what guarantees blacks the right to vote. People think, well, it's the Voting Rights Act. No. The Voting Rights Act does not grant right to vote. Voting Rights Act only helps enforce certain counties that used to use literacy tests. It's a very specific law. The right to vote is given by the 15th Amendment. It is unabridgable. I mean, it is right there, real simple. The new constitutions were eventually passed, and a number of black Americans were elected to national office under those new constitutions. This 1872 print by Currier and Ives shows the first 7 black Americans elected to the U.S. Congress. Significantly, all 7 were Republicans. On the left side of the picture is Hiram Rhodes Revels from Mississippi. An ordained minister, he served as a missionary and pastor, recruited 3 black regiments, and was a chaplain during the Civil War. Revels became America's first black U.S. senator.
Next is Benjamin Turner of Alabama. Turner was a slave during the Civil War, but within 5 years after the war, he had become a wealthy and prosperous businessman. Next is Robert DeLarge of South Carolina. Born as a slave, within 3 years of the end of the war, he was serving in the state house. He also chaired the Republican Party's platform committee and became a statewide elected official. Next is Josiah Walls of Florida. Walls was a slave during the Civil War and was forced to fight for the Confederate Army. After he was captured by Union troops, however, he promptly enlisted as a Union soldier and even became an officer. After his election to Congress, his credentials were challenged by Democrats and he was twice sent home. He was reelected after the first challenge, but during the second challenge, Democrats regained control of Florida and he was prevented from returning. Next is Jefferson Long of Georgia. Born as a slave, he was self-educated and built a thriving business. However, when elected to Congress as a Republican, Democrats boycotted his business, causing him great financial losses. Long was the first Black American to deliver a congressional speech in the U.S. House. Next is Joseph Hayne Rainey of South Carolina. Born a slave, he actually served briefly as Speaker of the U.S. House and was in Congress longer than any other Black American from that era. The seventh is Robert Brown Elliott, also of South Carolina. He was well educated, reading in Spanish, French, and Latin. In Congress, he led in the passage of civil rights bills over the strident opposition of congressional Democrats, and he later became Speaker of the House in the state legislature. As you move forward, because of the 14th Amendment, we can elect African Americans to Congress. And so these guys, and they're all Republicans, they joined with white Republicans. They passed 23 civil rights laws. Those 23 civil rights laws they passed, they ended segregation. They said you can no longer have distinctions on the basis of marriage. You can't have distinctions on the basis of property. You can't have distinctions in the military. I mean, it was really terrible, the things that, well, you can have courts for white, but you can't let blacks go into court. Now, whites can own property, blacks can't own property. So they have all these things. It gets wiped out. 23 laws that wipe all that out. The last civil rights law that they passed was in 1875. Do you know the next time Congress passed a civil rights law? It was 89 years later. Between 1861 and 1875, 14 years, we passed 23 civil rights laws. It stopped in 1875, and we didn't do it again until 1964. Why? Because in 1876, Democrats regained partial control of Congress. When Republicans had House and Senate and President, they're zipping these civil rights laws through. 1876, Democrats get back the House. That stops right there. Well, so for the next period of time, what you have is you've stopped civil rights laws, and in the South, you've kind of lost the end of Reconstruction, and the South is starting to get really violent now. You have all these slave owners, all these racist mentality people who are willing to form their own nation on the basis of race. And now you're trying to say that my elected representatives are black? I'm not going to do this. Well, in Democratic states, not only do you have Republicans, you've got black Republicans. So nationally, in 1866, to stop this forward progress, there was a group that was started to keep Republicans out of office. The group that was started in 1866, we recognize today, but it was the Ku Klux Klan. It was started by Democrats. And people say, well, they were started to whack blacks. No, they weren't. They were started to whack Republicans. You see,
okay, that's huge.
Yeah, just let me stop you right there for a moment.
Listen up.
Restate that if you would.
The Klan was started in 1866 by Democrats to whack Republicans and allow Democrats to regain control. But why is it so many blacks were the victims of the Klan? It's real simple. If you were black in America, you were Republican back then.
Many of our greatest revolutionary heroes were patriots of African descent. Many courageous and effective black leaders played pivotal roles in our...
I hope this history lesson is opening up you guys' eyes. Again, this is about history tonight. This is not about which party, but this is about history. This is something that you need to know. This is something that our children need to know. Many of you guys don't know it. You need to look it up. Again, it's American Heritage, and it's the series. And right now we listen to episode 24. And it's just giving us a lot of black history that is not given to our children, is not given in February at all for Black History Month, is not given. The truth is not being told. It's time to tell the truth. So let's listen to some more.
Government as early as the late 1800s. What is the story and inspiration behind these great patriots and heroes of the faith? And why have so many of their stories remained silent? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
The Klan terrorized Black Americans through murders and public floggings. Relief was granted only if they promised not to vote for Republican tickets, and violation of this oath was punishable by death. And since the Klan was targeted against Republicans in general, it did not limit its violence simply to Black Republicans. In this old illustration, the Klan in North Carolina is about to hang a white Republican. And in 1871, a Black U.S. congressman from South Carolina, Joseph Hayne Rainey, reported an incident concerning an elderly man named Dr. John Winsmith, a white Republican state senator.
The doctor, a man nearly 70 years of age, had been to town. Returning home late, he soon afterward retired. A little after midnight, he was aroused by someone knocking violently at his front door. Get out of here! Stop driving!
The Klan shot down this state senator, a white state senator, because he was Republican and was fighting for the rights of Blacks in his state. In that hail of bullets, Dr. Winsmith was hit 7 times. However, he survived the shooting and lived to testify before Congress about the attack made on him by the Klan. This is a Klan push card from 1868, about the size of a baseball card. It is entitled, Radical Members of the South Carolina Legislature. It shows 63 radicals. They were all Republicans. The Democrats called Republicans radicals because the Republican Party was biracial and allowed Blacks to vote and participate in the political process, thus making them radical in the Democrats' eyes. Of the 63 radicals, or Republicans, in the South Carolina legislature, 50 were Black and 13 were white. On the back of this card, all the names of the radical Republicans were listed. Evidently, if the Klan wanted to pay a night visit, as they had to Senator Winsmith, with the help of this card, they would know exactly who they were looking for. We know the Klan is often associated with the lynchings, and these are some of the most abominable pictures in history, but these are pictures of actual lynchings. 4,800 Americans were lynched. Now, out of the 4,800 that were lynched, 1,300 were white, 3,500 were Black.
We have never heard that before.
We've never heard 1,300 white lynched. I thought it was just lynching Blacks. Now they were lynching Republicans. But again, back at that point in American history, if you were Black, you were a Republican. You couldn't lynch every white you saw. Some of them might be Democrats. So you have to find out who they are. And that's why you have these little cards to identify the whites and the Blacks that are Republicans, so you know who you're going after. People say the Klan wasn't partisan. Really? That's kind of interesting that as you get into the 1920s and 30s and 40s, the Klan was actually a wing of the Democrat Party. Matter of fact, George Wallace, who ran for governor in the South, a very famous name in the South, he lost his first election because he refused to accept the Klan endorsement in the Democrat primary. So the second time he ran for office, he accepted the Klan endorsement and won the primary. You go into Texas, Ma Ferguson, she had trouble. She wouldn't accept the Klan primary, and it kept her from having a cohesive win as Texas governor. And she eventually became Texas governor. But this was a significant part of the Democrat Party. It was an entire wing in the Democrat Party. And as you look, here's a picture of a Klan parade. You actually in Washington, D.C. had 40,000 members marching the Klan parade at the turn of the century. They included U.S. senators, U.S. reps, Supreme Court justices, members of the Democrat Party.
When would that picture be taken?
This picture is going to be taken in about 1910. One of the great Klan recruiting films of all time is called Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation is really one of the first films that was ever done, a motion picture, and it shows the Klan as heroes saving the South from all the Blacks. And by the way, guess
where that film was shown. It was shown in the White House. It was the first film ever shown in the White House. It was shown by Democrat President Woodrow Wilson. When he became president, a number of blacks already held federal office. He got rid of them, got them out of office. Teddy Roosevelt got all sorts of ire when he invited Booker T. Washington to come to the White House. The first African-American to come to the White House, Booker T. Washington, invited by Republican President Teddy Roosevelt, who used him as an advisor. Well, we move on from Roosevelt. We move now, and Roosevelt's appointed a number of blacks in his administration. You move on into Woodrow Wilson. He gets all blacks gone, and he shows a Klan recruiting film at the White House. See, the Klan was an active part of American politics for way too long.
By 1875, only a decade after the Civil War, Republicans had successfully passed almost 24 civil rights laws, and Black American legislators often played significant roles in the debates surrounding the passage of such laws. One example involved a civil rights bill in 1871, a bill allowing the federal government to punish Klan violence. During the debates on that bill, Representative Joseph Hayne Rainey from South Carolina delivered a powerful speech during the debates on that bill, explaining why blacks were most often the targets of Klan violence.
When we call to mind the fact that this Klan persecution is waged against men for the simple reason that they dare vote with the Republican Party, the question is sometimes asked, why do not the courts of law afford redress? We answer, because the courts are in many instances under the control of Democrats who are wholly opposed to the impartial administration of law and equity. What benefit would result from appeal to courts whose officers are secretly in sympathy with the very evil against which we are striving? If the Negroes, numbering 1/8 of the population of these United States, would only cast their votes in the interest of the Democrats, all open measures of violence against them would immediately be suspended and their rights as American citizens recognized. But I can only say that we love freedom more, vastly more than slavery. Consequently, we hope to keep clear of the Democrats. I will also say that in the state of South Carolina, which I represent, there is no disturbance of an alarming character in any one of the counties in which the Republicans have a majority. The troubles are usually in those sections in which the Democrats have control. I say to the entire membership of the Democratic Party that upon your hands rests the blood of the loyal men of the South. Disclaim it as you will, but the stain is there to prove your criminality before man and God, in the world in the day of retribution, which will surely come. I pity the man or party of men who would seek to ride into power over the dead body of a legitimate opponent. I can say for my people that we are fully determined to stand by the Republican Party and the government. We have resolved to be loyal and firm, and as Queen Esther said long ago, if we perish, we perish. I earnestly hope that this bill will pass.
Many of our greatest revolutionary heroes were patriots of African descent. Many courageous and effective black leaders played pivotal roles in our government as early as the late 1800s. What is the story and inspiration behind these great patriots and heroes of the faith? And why have so many of their stories remained silent? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
As you move forward, you finally get to 1892, and that's the first time the Democrats regain the presidency, Grover Cleveland, the House, and the Senate. They get all of that in 1892. So having regained everything in 1892, now Republicans got it under Abraham Lincoln in 1861. Now Democrats get it back. They repealed every civil rights law. They repealed the Klan laws, the force laws. They repealed the anti-segregation. They repealed everything. So it's gone. And at that point is where you have the real introduction of the black codes. So since all the federal laws are off the books, now you have the southern states that start saying, we'll do a poll tax, we'll do property taxes, we'll do the grandfather clause. They go through 11 different legal ways to keep blacks from voting in the South. They had literacy tests. Alabama had literacy tests. And you think, well, what's wrong with making sure people can read before they vote? I mean, you got to read the ballot. No. These literacy tests in Alabama were over 20 pages long. And they weren't whether you could read or not. The literacy tests were things like, what rights do you have if you're indicted by a grand jury that's different from being indicted by a regular jury? Who knows the answer to that? But that's what they gave to African Americans, and they gave them such tedious tests that, of course, all blacks turned out to be illiterate. They couldn't vote. They also had what they called hide-and-seek polling places. They had Democrats vote over here, they had Republicans vote over here. Well, they would take the Republican ballots and move them around to different places throughout the day so that you couldn't find where the ballot was. So that was part of what went on. As a matter of fact, lest people think that we're really just kind of picking on stuff here, this is part of the presidential election of 1928. It starts up top. It says, what happened when the Republican Party was in power in Alabama? This is a picture of the 1872 Alabama legislature filled with whites and blacks. They go on and say, now, if you believe in white supremacy, vote the straight Democrat ticket November the 6th. This is not a majority. Wow. That's a statement of fact. It was not until 1944 the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the Democrat policy that said blacks cannot be elected to office as Democrat.
And I heard you correctly. You said 1944,
1944. Now, the first Southern Democrat elected to Congress was in 1972, and that was Barbara Jordan, and that was Andrew Young. Now, how did they get elected out of the South as a Democrat in 1972? Because the Supreme Court had just issued a ruling that told the Democrat legislature of Georgia and the Democrat legislature of Texas to redraw lines so that black could be elected. They gerrymandered lines to keep blacks from being elected. Had it not been for the Supreme Court getting involved and telling the two Democrat legislatures to redraw lines, those two blacks would not have been elected. So the whole black history aspect, it's a very partisan thing, but we hear nothing about it, but it is so well documented. Although history is clear that there have been major differences in how political parties treated black Americans, neither party is completely blameless in all of its actions, nor have all the leaders in a party always been good or always been bad. Understanding this truth, Representative Robert Brown Elliott, even though he was a strong Republican leader in his day, wisely advised,
I'm a slave to principles. I call no political party master. I have ever most sincerely embraced the democratic and representative ideal, not indeed as represented or professed by any political party, but by its true significance as transfigured in the Declaration of Independence and in the injunctions of Christianity.
Elliott's admonition is wise. Align with political candidates that conform to what he called the injunctions of Christianity. Republican Frederick Douglass, who served as a minister of the gospel, had agreed, declaring,
I have one great political idea. That idea is an old one, is widely and generally assented to. Nevertheless, is very generally trampled upon and disregarded. The best expression of it I found in the Bible. It is in substance, righteousness exalteth a nation. Sin is a reproach to any people. Proverbs 14:34. Now this constitutes my politics, the negative and positive of my politics, and the whole of my politics. I feel it my duty to do all in my power to infuse this idea into the public mind that it may be practiced.
Douglass was right. As citizens, we must vote righteously. And by the way, this first assumes that we are voting. This responsibility to vote and to vote righteously has been made clear from generation to generation. One such voice heralding this responsibility was that of Charles Finney. Finney was a famous American revivalist, a leader in the American revival movement called the Second Great Awakening. He was also the president of a college that even decades before the Civil War admitted both black and white students as equals. Reverend Finney wisely admonished,
The time has come that Christians must vote for honest men and take consistent ground in politics. Christians have been exceedingly guilty in this manner, but the time has come when they must act differently. Christians seem to act as if they think God does not see what they do in politics, but I tell you, he does see it, and he will bless or curse this nation according to the course Christians take in politics.
So when voting, no vote should be cast solely.
All right, I'm going to stop it right there. And that's the key, that God sees everything we do, and we should vote the way God the way we believe in God and way we say we believe in God. Again, I did this for history. I did this so that our children and grandchildren, again, go on YouTube. It's called American Heritage Series. Just go through and watch it all. Just go through and watch everything about it so you can know. Let your children know. Matter of fact, do a test. Ask your children, do they know who Frederick Douglass was? Because a lot don't know. But through here, this history is something we need to know. We need to know all about the history. So whatever we decide to do to make a better city, a better nation, a better state, we can do it with the understanding that whatever we do it unto the Lord. Whatever we do it unto God. That God is pleased with everything that we are doing. If you like this show, Milwaukee, You Deserve Better, then we ask that you support us. You can cash out at West God Squad. You can cash app us, or you can send a check, money order to. Give me 1 second, and I will put it on the screen for you. To 7090 North Milwaukee Street, Suite 348, Milwaukee, Wisconsin 53202. And if you would like to send us a letter and tell us what you think about our show, and I hope that you are learning from it. I hope that you are being empowered by it. I hope you are being educated by it. I hope it's been a blessing unto you. So this is David King for Milwaukee, You Deserve Better. I want you guys to know that I love each and every one of you. I'm praying for you. May the grace of God be with you until Thursday. God bless.